I don't think one's progress as a writer is always linear. You have setbacks, and each novel is its own unique set of really annoying problems.
Hello and welcome to Collective, the Royal Literary Fund podcast about all things writing. I'm Sonia Faleiro and I'm so happy you could join us. Our guest today is someone whose thrillers have kept millions of readers up all night. But before we start picking her brain, let me quickly remind you what Collected is about. We have a truly amazing archive of conversations with writers from every corner of the literary world. In each episode, we invite a guest to listen to some clips from the archive that capture moments of honesty and insight. And through them, we get a richer sense of what it means to be a writer. Okay, let's bring on our guest. Paula Hawkins is the best-selling author of The Girl in the Train, which took the world by storm, selling over 20 million copies. She's also written Into the Water, A Slow Fire Burning, and most recently, The Blue Hour, each one pushing the boundaries of what we expect from crime fiction. Paula is also a trustee of the Royal Literary Fund. Paula, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
For our first theme, we are talking about how writers got started, both as aspiring storytellers and as professionals navigating this sometimes confusing industry. Our clip comes from poet Gabriel Badamosi, who co-founded Writers Mosaic. We'll hear him reading a letter he wrote to his younger self, full of reflections on the early days of his writing life.
Dear Gabriel, you survived when you didn't think you were going to. And because you didn't think, you couldn't plan. So here's how it goes. Living moment to moment as a poet with no visible means of support. Remember your dad saying, a free education is a gift from God. After that, nothing's free. Get a job and stick to it, because after 35, it's all downhill. You didn't believe him. You thought, writing's my job, and you couldn't see to the end of your 20s. Money was a pitfall. Marx said so. It would live your life instead of you. What you needed was to live now with the kind of poetry that took your breath away. You never imagined a world in which education was no longer free, or one in which you'd meet people embarrassed by the lack of an education. Although you taught your mother arithmetic to help with the shopping, after an Irish education minister had said to her generation that we should not educate the Irish people for fear they lose their ancestral culture. Yet, you live now in a world where the weight of the mortgage falls on the thinking space and mortarboard of a degree, which still doesn't pay the rent. You didn't see the erosion of the welfare state in its life support function for poets. How could you? The Berlin Wall hadn't fallen. Blaming the poor for signing on in a time of mass unemployment wasn't popular. Employment in public organisations, from the police to the BBC, was still hideously white. And the only way to protect yourself from discrimination was not to join them. You had to remain anonymous and invisible as a condition of being able to get on with your life, as the only way of being able to walk through exclusionary walls and ignore glass ceilings. But invisibility curtailed your ability to speak, at the same time as it meant you saw things differently. Being a poet, you saw as a vow of poverty, a vacation in freedom to think and speak, a far call from a life of conformity preached by the money and policed by fear. But it was, like the social unrest of those days, entirely unpredictable, stuttering to life, something still coming into being. If I were to tell you now, money talks and you don't, would you believe me? You'd disappear on me. I know. That ghost again, with the see-through fingers and the silver walk, holding out your heart like a window through which you see things you can only whisper, as people do a song into the ear of the loved and dying, for fear it would break if told in any other way. You cloaked in glass, allegory, symbol, and silence. You pulled the short straw of your ancestral cultures. You spoke only with the dead. You bore with the living. You waited. Don't. Live. Right. And don't pity the older man who suffers the consequences of your attempt at honesty. Just remember, he knows what you've lived, and he knows where the bodies are buried. Yours, Gabriel.
You know, I've heard that a few times, and I find it profoundly moving.
That's wonderful.
And the reason I thought we should include this in our episode is because I know that when people hear your name, they think of your enormous success.
Mm-hmm.
But before you became enormously successful, you had a career as a writer doing a wide variety of things and trying to make it. So when you think back on those days and the vulnerability and the stress and the anxiety that you felt, what advice would you give your younger self?
I always find it difficult to think of what you would tell a younger self, because although I did struggle a lot and I had some very difficult times, I feel as though I needed to go through all those things to get to the point I am now. I was a journalist for a while. That's what I wanted to do, because I never imagined making a living out of writing fiction. I didn't know anyone who did anything like that. Journalism seemed like a practical way to make money from writing. But I always wrote fiction on the side. I had this desire to tell stories that I never managed to sort of quash. So I wrote things that I never showed to anyone. But eventually, I think you get to a point where you've got to let those stories out. And I suppose so that the advice maybe would be to start sharing that work a bit earlier. Unless you share your work, it's almost impossible to not become sort of locked in your own head, going round and round and round thinking, is this any good? No, it's probably not. I'll start again. I'll try something new. You need that feedback. So I think I probably should have done that earlier. But at the same time, I think maybe I had to go through all those stages. Maybe I was just a slow developer.
Did you have people that you could count on to support you, to encourage you to continue, even when you reached a phase where you were unable to continue selling the books that you were doing?
I had and still have a very good agent who I've been working with now for 21 years because I wrote a nonfiction book, and that's when our relationship started. And without her support and encouragement, I don't think I would have ever written The Girl on the Train, because I did have a really difficult period when I was writing different books under a pseudonym, and that didn't sell well. But I always had lots of ideas, and she was the person that I bounced those ideas off, and she was the one who kept encouraging me. So yeah, I was incredibly lucky to have, a professional relationship with someone that was really nurturing and wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And did you have people who said, hey, Paula, this is not the best idea given the economy we're in, or given what a usual trajectory of a writer looks like?
I don't think I was listening to anyone at that point. I knew that I didn't want to write for the newspapers anymore. So I don't think anyone said that to me. I think I kind of knew that. I knew those things. I knew that it was crazy. But I just kept pushing. I just kept going anyway, because it was what I wanted at the time. But I think I was starting to get to a point where it felt to me like the last roll of the dice, the Girl on the Train, as though if this one doesn't work, I'm going to have to do something else. But that's with hindsight, I say that. I have no idea whether I really would have given up.
Let's move on to our second theme, which is navigating criticism. It's something every writer faces, whether it's rejection, harsh reviews, or even polite indifference. Those moments can sting. Here's a clip from Doug Johnston, who is a fellow host on Collected, sharing his encounters with rejection.
When I first seriously embarked on the novel writing game, something like 15 years ago, I don't think I appreciated just how much rejection is woven into the fabric of the whole writing experience. I began writing my first novel in 2003, and I was completely clueless about the publishing industry. I'd never met an author, agent, editor, or anyone connected with the business of getting books onto shelves. When I finished that manuscript, I bought the Writers and Artists Yearbook and emailed every agent and editor in it who seemed like they might be vaguely interested in the kind of thing I was writing. It's a numbers game. Of the people I contacted, half never replied, and of the ones who did, half said no thanks. So I sent out synopses and opening chapters, and half the recipients never replied, and again, most said no thanks. A few got the full manuscript, but either never replied or said no thanks, and so on. In the end, I think I got around 50 rejections from agents for that manuscript, and at least 25 rejections from editors. I was pretty depressed. I still didn't know anyone in the industry, and I had no idea if what I was writing was even any good. But I got lucky. A couple of the editors who rejected that book did so in such a kind way that it spurred me on to write another one. When that novel was finished, they both offered to publish it, much to my immense surprise. I often think that if they hadn't been encouraging in the first place, maybe I wouldn't have persisted with the whole writing malarkey. What I realise now is that it's a war of attrition. If you want to get anywhere in the book world, you have to keep chipping away at the edifice, working away at your craft, tapping along on a laptop. And the rejections never end. I think a lot of aspiring writers presume that once you've had a publishing deal, the hard work is over. The truth is very different. I've had a relatively benign experience in publishing, but I'm still on my third agent and third publisher after 10 books. And the rejections keep coming. I recently had a novel out on submission to all the major UK publishers, an attempt to write something different for me. Despite effusive praise from a number of editors, the manuscript was rejected by 21 of the 22 publishing houses that we sent it to. And those rejections hurt, of course they do, but you have to develop a very thick skin in this industry. You have to realise that all kinds of people, agents, editors, publishers, booksellers and readers, will reject your work for all sorts of reasons, and there's precious little you can do except suck it up. Ian Rankin was asked in a recent interview for writing advice. Be lucky, he said, and stay lucky. I would add, and learn to accept rejection.
Paula, I can talk about criticism with you because you've had enormous success. So I don't feel bad talking to you about the very small handful of mixed reviews that you've gotten. You got mixed reviews for Into the Water, which is kind of wild given how many copies it sold and how many people loved it. But given how your first book, Girl in the Train, was received, people noticed.
Oh, yes, I did notice. And I'm not sure I'd call them mixed. It got very hard. Well, at the time, it felt very harsh. Yes, it was badly reviewed. It was poorly reviewed, Into the Water. It was commercially very successful. It was very difficult for me. I'd had a difficult time with that novel anyway because I was trying to write it while the craziness of the Girl on the Train's success was all going on in the background, which is very distracting and quite difficult. And there was a movie and there was all that stuff. So I'm somebody who likes to sit quietly at a desk while I'm writing a novel. And that was very difficult in that time. So the criticism was very harsh. It felt incredibly public. You feel as though everyone in the world knows that your book is being poorly reviewed. And then I think it's quite a lot of time later you realize there aren't that many people in the world who even read the book pages. But it felt very painful to me at the time. I think partly because I also felt personally that there were aspects of that novel that I wasn't happy with. So that's, in some ways, some of the critics were really pressing on a bruise. I think my relationship to criticism has changed a little bit. Although I will still always read the reviews. I'm not one of those people who just won't read them because I always think I can imagine people saying much worse things about me than actually they would ever say. I'd rather know than imagine. I think that's the thing, and I think sometimes it can be quite useful. I also think sometimes you read a review and you sort of think, well, I'm not sure this person actually engaged with it, or perhaps they read it really quickly, because sometimes you can sort of bat them aside. It is very difficult. However, the fact that you're being reviewed at all is kind of a privilege, because not everyone, and I know this because I've had books, the books I wrote earlier that weren't successful, that weren't reviewed. And so that I think that indifference is possibly worse in some ways. Although I probably wouldn't have said that when Into the Water was published.
Have you ever found a critical review useful?
I think they can certainly be thought-provoking. Obviously, there's not, if they're responding to a particular thing in a particular novel, you can't go back and change that novel. But that might stay in your mind when you come to sit down to write the next one. And it may change the way in which you approach that piece of work, I suppose. What I came to realize was that I need to really think very carefully about which idea it is I'm going to develop next, because I think I possibly rushed into the water. I was so eager to get the next novel under my belt that I maybe didn't give myself the time and space that I needed. And I think some of the critics could see that. And so I probably would have spotted it myself, but maybe it was useful to think about those things later. But in other ways, for a lot of writers, I think it's probably quite nice to just put all criticism out of your head when you're sitting down, because you don't want to be listening to too many other voices in the early part of a novel, do you?
That's really good advice. You talk about the fact that you felt pressure to publish another book after The Girl on the Train. Where was that pressure coming from?
I mean, honestly, it was mostly coming from me. I had a 2-book deal, but my publishers were not saying, where's the next one? Where's the next one? They were perfectly happy at that point because The Girl on the Train was still flying off shelves. I was very aware that a lot of people struggled with the second, the difficult second novel. And I just wanted to try and get that done as soon as possible and, so that I could move on to the next thing. So it was mostly pressure that came from within me. It wasn't something external.
What's gorgeous about the story is that then you came up with A Slow Fire Burning, which I found unputdownable. It was such a captivating book, such a tricky little puzzle, and yet so captivating, especially for somebody who lives in London and who's walked down those paths and seen those houseboats. Was there a special joy in then publishing a book that critics were like, oh my gosh, she's back?
Yeah, it was great. It was such a relief that got the reception that it did. But, it did, I think that what I was just talking about, that thing of allowing myself a little bit more time to decide on what I was going to do. I definitely did that with A Slow Fire Burning. In fact, there was a bigger gap between books 2 and 3 than there was between any of the others. I've allowed myself a long time to develop the story that I wanted to write and the characters. But it was really great to get some very positive reviews then. Yeah, it was a relief.
All right, let's shift gears and talk about what you do, crime fiction, and why we are so drawn to stories of moral complexity and mystery. This next clip is from Lee Russell, who recounts how a simple train journey sparked a breakthrough in her plot.
One day, my train was briefly delayed just outside a station. This was nothing unusual. Happening to turn and glance over my shoulder, I gazed through the window at a strip of waste ground that ran alongside the railway track on the other side of a high wire fence. On an overcast day in early autumn, straggly shrubs and thick-stemmed brambles had begun to shed their leaves, while behind them tall grasses and nettles trembled in stray gusts of wind. On the face of it, this dull and dreary scene must have been one of the least likely settings in which to find inspiration. And yet, by a lucky coincidence, just at that very moment, I chanced to be struggling with the problem of imagining a deposition site for a body in one of my crime novels. How to dispose of a dead body without attracting any unwelcome attention poses a problem when writing a crime novel. There has to be a link between killer and victim, however tenuous, because the random murder of a stranger is unsatisfactory for readers of fiction. A successful narrative offers readers a killer with a rational motive for choosing the victim, allowing readers an opportunity to try and unravel the plot for themselves. If the identity of the killer is obvious, not only will readers solve the mystery early on and lose interest in the story, but the fictional detective will either appear stupid or else will resolve the case so quickly the book will be over in the first chapter. So fictional killers have to dispose of their victims in a location which cannot easily be traced back to them, because there needs to be enough detective work for an investigation to last for 300 to 400 pages. In addition, unlike in real life, bodies in fiction are preferably discovered unexpectedly in atmospheric or surprising places, which can add to the drama and interest of the narrative. If the location itself is a place familiar to the reader, the setting can add to the reader's sense of shock and outrage when a fictional dead body is discovered there, making the narrative more credible and giving it an added sense of immediacy. So there I was on my journey, struggling to work out where my next victim might be discovered, when my train stopped outside a station. While I sat staring absent-mindedly at the neglected patch of ground outside, scarcely even registering what I was seeing, an idea pinged into my mind. Perhaps it was a sign fixed to rusty railings adorned with barbed wire that gave me the idea. The sign said, "No rubbish to be deposited."
Your novels are designed as intricately as puzzles. Could you talk about your creative process in developing the narrative structure of your books? Specifically, do you begin with the overall puzzle or the characters? And how do these elements influence each other through the process of writing?
It's not always the same. I tend to start with character. There's always someone who I've been thinking about for a long time. That tends to be a starting point. So with The Girl on the Train, it was Rachel. With The Slow Fire Burning, it was Laura. There was a particular character who I'd been sort of thinking about for ages. But then, a character's great. That's not a novel. You need something to get them moving. And so sometimes that will be a location. My most recent novel, it was very much the setting of the book, which is this tidal island. In The Girl on the Train, it was that idea that she sees something from her train commute. So I generally I have a character and I have one other element to get them moving. Sometimes it's a crime. Sometimes I know what the central crime is going to be. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I have to think of that afterwards. I do need to know when I sit down to stop to write what the crime is and who done it. Then I can leave everything else vague. And not plan too much. But I need to have that point that I'm aiming for.
So, are you mobilized by, say, news events or something that's happening in your personal life? Where does that idea generally tend to come from?
All sorts of things. And both of those things, there is always some part of me in the books and in the characters, something that comes from me. But again, yes, a lot of it comes also from something that you'll read in the news. I don't write about, obviously, as you know, gangsters or serial killers. They're ordinary people whose lives have gone wrong or who've had some sort of brush with something frightening. And I remember reading, for example, a story of a young woman who had, when she was, I think, still a schoolgirl, this man had stopped his car and had tried to get her to get into the car with him. And that man turned out to be a serial killer. Fortunately, she didn't get into the car. But that story, I kept thinking about that. Imagine that happening to you, having a brush with something really terrible. And then something like that ended up in a slow fire burning. So that is often something that happens with me, that I'll sort of think, well, how did these people get there? And what happened to them afterwards? And how could a normal person possibly have ended up in this awful situation? So those are the things that I'll draw from real life. And then the characters, often you'll have been told a story by a friend or something, and you'll just take one aspect of that and obsess about it for ages and then build a character from that little point of obsession.
It's the ordinariness that makes crime fiction, good crime fiction, really frightening.
That idea that it could happen to any of us, or that you don't really know what's going on under the surface. Patricia Highsmith wrote about this really well, about how thrilling it is to imagine that the people you pass in the street might be harboring terrible desires and what have you. I do think that there's something extraordinary about that, and something that is enjoyable and thrilling at the same time.
Well, when readers read a really good book of crime fiction or a thriller, I mean, there is a part of us that's like, who writes this? Who is this person? What is going on in their brain? And what is going on in your brain?
I'm really interested in human relationships and how human relationships can go wrong, and the simple things that can throw a life off course. I think there is that feeling of there, but for the grace of God sometimes, that you feel like it wouldn't have taken that much to have sent one's life off in a terrible direction. We think of ourselves as, oh, this could never happen to me. People are always saying that, oh, this is not the kind of place these things happen. But actually, things can happen. Bad things, frightening things can happen in all sorts of different circumstances. And I'm always intrigued to unpick how that happened. Maybe it's kind of a reassurance for myself. But yes, it's those family relationships, close friendships, love affairs, all the ways that those go wrong and how people become broken by a traumatic event or by something like a relationship breakup. And then imagining, you just run with it and see what terrible places that might lead.
Because for all of us, the defining experience of our life is childhood.
Mm-hmm.
They say there's nothing more. That's what defines everything. That's the foundation. Given your background, your very interesting life of movement, of migration from Zimbabwe to England, the adaptation that was required, the pressures, and probably seeing, hearing, and experiencing things that other kids your age, certainly once you'd moved here, hadn't experienced. Do you see something there?
I mean, I had a very happy childhood, so I can't blame my parents for my obsession with crime. Although my mother, who grew up on a farm in what was then Rhodesia, was a great teller of terrible stories. I mean, good stories, but frightening stories. So I think I always enjoyed sort of dark fairy tales, dark stories. There was definitely something about moving at a formative age, 17, from Zimbabwe to London, about feeling myself very much to be an outsider, struggling to make friends, being lonely, watching people, wanting to wish myself into a different life. I think a lot of writers will recognize that feeling. And I think that is something that I tap into quite often. I'm not like that anymore, but I can go back to and imagine that feeling. And certainly sort of Rachel from The Girl on the Train very much came from a moment there. See, I was much younger, but that feeling of being an outsider and sitting on the train, watching the people around me, imagining their happiness and feeling my own loneliness quite acutely.
I read somewhere that you changed your accent to better fit in.
Well, yes. But so I moved from Harare to London in 1989. And Zimbabwean accent is quite similar to South African accent. So everyone assumed I was South African. I didn't want to be thought of as a white South African in 1989. People's opinions of white South Africans were justifiably not great. So yeah, I became quite English.
All right, let's move on to our fourth theme, which is about the day in the life of a writer when one is not chasing down eureka moments, which is just the ordinary things that writers do to get words down on the page. Our clip is from Ross Schwartz, a literary translator who takes us through her daily routine.
A day in the life of a literary translator. In summer, I wake around 7 and have a coffee before whizzing over to the ladies' pond on Hampstead Heath. At that hour, there are few swimmers. My head empties of all the everyday chatter, and I move at a contemplative pace, pondering a translation problem. My thoughts associate freely as I swim among the ducks, coots, and moorhens with their chicks. The solution inevitably bubbles up from some recess of my brain. Home to breakfast, and I'm at my desk by 9:30. I'm translating a memoir by a French writer who lives in the USA. She describes a walk in Vermont where the frogs chirping heralds the spring. Frogs chirping? I query it with the author. Yes, she tells me, it's the sound a certain species of North American frog makes. Definitely not croaking. I spend a couple of hours on a website listening to frog noises until I find the one matching the description. Email it to the author, who confirms that she does indeed mean the spring peeper frog. A quick lunch of salad or leftovers, then back to my desk. Respond to a request for a quote to translate an exhibition catalogue for an art gallery in France. A courier arrives with the proofs from my most recent translation. The publisher is asking for a 1-week turnaround. I'll have to fit this in somehow. There go my weekend plans. Much as I enjoy the rich variety of my translation life, I feel as if I'm permanently juggling several balls while walking a tightrope. I switched to working on an excerpt for a beauty contest. That's when a publisher is seeking to commission a translation and asks several translators to produce a sample chapter so they can choose the one they prefer. This is a fast-paced thriller. There's a passage that contains some technical weapons vocabulary. I spend an hour or so watching American YouTube clips of beefy guys reveling in the minutiae of loading a gun, thinking to myself that if ever the thought police were to check my online activity, they'd be perplexed by my search history, flipping effortlessly from frogs to firearms within minutes. I work in bursts, idly watching the birds on the feeder on my office window, and frequently finding myself beak to beak with a robin or a blue tit, while batting away emails. I like to respond immediately to messages that can be dealt with swiftly, otherwise they slip down my inbox and I wake up at 3 a.m, realising I've forgotten to send my bio to a conference organiser or answer an editorial query. I stop work at around 6 p.m, lock up my garden office and cross the patio to the kitchen where I prepare dinner. Cooking is therapeutic after sitting at my desk all day using my brain. It's good to be doing something creative with my hands while still mulling over an unsolved translation challenge.
Paula, I remember you once quoted Hilary Mantel's advice about writing with the maximum uncertainty you can tolerate. Can you tell us how you built a day around that?
Well, to me, that's just about not planning out everything that you're going to do. So allowing yourself loads of space for ideas to occur while you're actually writing, because I think that's where the most interesting ideas seem to come. And that's the most enjoyable writing, I think, as well, is when it feels slightly risky because you don't really know what you're doing, but you start to see different connections, I think, and you start to come up with all sorts of scenarios that I don't think one can really predict. So that's the uncertainty that I was thinking about then. But actually, in terms of my sort of day-to-day, it's very not structured, but I tend to do the same thing every day. I'm having been a freelance journalist for ages, I'm quite disciplined. I get up, go for a run or what have you, and then sit down at my desk and work a normal day. I'm not one of those people who works late into the night or what have you, or gets up at 4 a.m. So that kind of structure I need, actually, that kind of boringness, that routine. But then I think when you're actually the writing itself, you want to leave loads of space for anything to develop, really.
And are you able to work every single day? How many hours a day do you end up writing?
That depends hugely on how well it's going, and where I am, what other things I've got going on. If it's going well, I can sit there for hours and hours and hours. If it's not, it can be like pulling teeth. But I think I'm another person who writes in short bursts. I do like write in short bursts, and then I'll, maybe read for a bit or go and do something else and then come back and have another short burst. Definitely the morning is the best time for me. By mid-afternoon, I start to run out of steam, though I might come back to it in the evening. But I think if you have the luxury that I do of just doing that as your only job, you also have the luxury of not trying to force things. So if I'm finding myself facing a particularly knotty problem, I do allow myself to go for a walk, or I'd like to read in the bath, so I take a book and go and read in the bath. And then almost that's, I think, when your unconscious starts to unknot the problems, where you look away from them for a moment.
And is there something that is most likely to distract you?
Well, like everyone, I fear I'm easily distracted by the internet, by news, by, social media. Yeah, that would be my main distraction. Boringly, sorry.
Tell me a little bit more about your process in terms of writing and editing. I know a lot of writers have this idea that you get the first draft done and then you start tinkering. Is that your process as well?
In theory, I think that's a very good way to go about it. In practice, it I often don't do that. I'll start writing and then I'll tinker a little bit and then write a bit more and then decide, actually, I'm going to come at it from a different angle. So I'm not one of those people who gets the whole first draft down. Though theoretically, if I were giving advice to people, I would say get the whole first draft down. I just think, sometimes it's difficult to follow that advice. And I often spend quite a lot of time tinkering with the first third of a novel before I can move on to the rest. But I mean, I also think that's probably not that surprising, because that's where you're laying all your groundwork, and that's where you're getting to know the people that you're going to write about really well and really understand what motivates them and how they feel about the other characters in the novel and what's likely to push them over the edge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you do multiple drafts before you hand your book over?
It's not always the same. I would love to be one of those people who sort of finesses everything to perfection before they hand it over, but I'm not. The last novel I wrote, The Blue Owl, was a much more complete affair by the time I gave it to my editors, whereas Into the Water, there was a lot more back and forth. There will always be many, many drafts, but some of them, there'll have been more editorial input early on than others. The Blue Hour definitely had the least editorial input. I loved writing The Blue Hour. I saw the whole novel, I think, more completely from the start. And I just, I really trusted myself on that book. So I'm hoping I'll be able to do it again. But I don't think one's progress as a writer is always linear. You have setbacks, and each novel is its own unique set of really annoying problems.
That's so interesting what you say about The Blue Hour, because I felt it was the one novel that you've written where you wanted your readers to linger on every line. I felt every line had been polished to a sheen, whereas with The Girl on the Train, it was a propulsive story. I didn't feel like I was being asked to linger. I was being pulled along, and I loved that experience, but it's a completely different experience from The Blue Hour.
That's so interesting you say that, because I think I saw that how The Blue Hour was going to play out in plot terms quite easily. I had the luxury of spending all this time on the language, which I loved. But I don't always have that time. If you've been spending months and months and months with knotty plot issues, you might not get that time at the end to really finesse the language and to make sure that it sounded perfect. But I did really enjoy that with The Blue Hour. So who knows whether I'll be able to do that again. But for me, that's one of the big joys of being a writer. It's just really spend that time making sure everything sounds right in your head when you read it out loud, that the sentences sound right.
All right, let's now move on to our fifth theme, which is the idea of an art monster, a term from writer Jenny Offel, and the question of who's allowed to be one. This gets into gender biases, cultural expectations, and the ways we judge or celebrate creative people. In our last clip, we'll hear Pragya Agarwal talking about how blue plaques, those commemorative signs we see on buildings, highlight inequities in who gets recognized as a great writer or thinker.
When I was asked to write this essay about a literary blue plaque, I looked through the list of blue plaques on English Heritage website for several hours, and all the various photos that I had stored on my phone from every trip to London. I don't have exact data on this, but my initial research shows that there are very few blue plaques commemorating Black and Asian people. Only about 5% of the 1,000 blue plaques. About 15% of the total are of women. Women of Black and brown backgrounds are even fewer. These statistics are important because these plaques make the invisible history visible and prominent. And the names and legacy live on through the subconscious of the people who see these plaques every day. Our landscape is very gendered, and this is reflected in the place and street names around us. When we don't see certain people named and commemorated, we can be led to believe that these people did not contribute to society or literature in the same way. And through this invisibility, they become marginalized yet again, pushed to the fringes of history. Non-fiction women writers are also underrepresented. I counted only 3 women in there at last count.
critical, serious nonfiction, long-form writing has long been associated with men, grounded in our societal norms around masculinity and femininity. Men are perceived to carry gravitas and are rational and scientific, while women are understood to be more emotional and tend to look inwards rather than outwards at conditions of society. These stereotypes mean that even today, male writers of nonfiction are believed to be writing larger critical bodies of work and receive more attention in media and in bookshops, and therefore topping the sale charts. These plaques can also tell us about the challenges writers encountered in the past based on their identities, making us realize how much things have changed and also how far we still have to go. For instance, a plaque for George Eliot, erected in 1905 at Holly Lodge, 31 Wimbledon Park Road, Wimbledon, continues to remind us that our names have certain stereotypes associated with us, and that we can be discriminated against based on what affiliation our name evokes. Marianne Evans was justifiably worried that being a woman, she might encounter prejudice from the readers and so had to hide behind a pseudonym. She also desired anonymity, but also wished to avoid scandal as she was living openly with a married man, something that was a social taboo at the time. One of the few women campaigners and writers is Caroline Elizabeth Sarah Norton, who has a blue plaque dedicated to her at 3 Chesterfield Street, Mayfair, where she lived for over 30 years between 1845 to 1877. Born in London, Norton campaigned for rights of women who were separated from their husbands and was instrumental in the passage of the 1839 Custody of Infants Act, which has been described as the first piece of feminist legislation. She was married to George Norton in 1827 at the age of 19. The marriage was violent and abusive, a drastic mismatch of intellect, and Norton had to support her family with her writing. She published a collection of verses, The Sorrows of Rosalie in 1829 and The Undying One in 1830, which resulted in her appointment as editor of La Belle Assembly and Court magazine. They had 3 sons in quick succession, and finally, after 8 years of abuse and physical violence, Norton left the family home in 1835, but had to return very quickly as her husband refused her access to her sons. A year later, she was locked out of her house as her husband took their sons away with him and once again did not allow her to see them. He also accused Caroline of adultery, which, even though unproven, marked her as a bad mother and a social outcast.
Paula, in The Blue R, you grapple with whether women can truly dedicate themselves to their art without societal penalty. It's a contrast to how male authors are celebrated. You've mentioned Doris Lessing as an example of this double standard. What do you want to tell people who are striving to embrace their inner art monster, despite the hurdles thrown their way?
Well, I don't think I want to tell anyone to be monstrous. I definitely think there is obviously a double standard, or has been in the past, about the way monstrous, I'm doing big air quotes here, women are treated, and how the monstrous men are allowed to get away with more. I would say that women should give themselves the permission to allow their work to take over their lives sometimes. You are allowed to lose yourself in your work sometimes. I think that more women should give themselves the permission to do that, and maybe let the people around them, whether it's the men in their lives or other women, pick up some of the slack sometimes. I guess it's an easy thing for me to say because I don't have children, but I think that's probably an area where women don't sometimes allow themselves the space they need and the time, because they have all these other pressures and all these other calls on their time.
Can I ask what drew you to this idea?
The art monsters. I mean, I was writing about a female artist. I wanted to write about somebody who was determined to devote herself to her work. I had been reading various memoirs and biographies, people like Hepworth, Celia Paul. I'd been reading a lot about Lee Krasner, all sorts of artists, and thinking about the ways in which they were written about, they were talked about, the interpretations that were made of their work, the things that were said about them. And it just felt to me that this would be a preoccupation for this woman. It made sense to me that she would feel a very particular way about her own work and what she was allowed to do and how she was allowed to live.
Mm-hmm. Is it something that you felt in your work? Do you feel that your writing would have been received differently?
Oh, I really don't know actually about that. I think that in crime fiction, I mean, women have traditionally been quite well respected in crime fiction, going back to Agatha Christie and people like Ruth Rendon, Patricia Highsmith. There is a long tradition of women writing great crime fiction and being very well respected. So I don't think I came into it thinking about it particularly from my own perspective. But I was looking more at the art world. And I think in literary fiction, I think certainly it's for a long time. Well, we have the Women's Prize for a reason. That it was more difficult for a woman to make a mark. And still, I think, women are reviewed less, literary writers anyway, than men are, even though I'm sure things are shifting.
Paula, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. To everyone listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Perhaps you've got a burning question about the writing process or an idea that's been sparked by something Paula said. Let us know using the hashtag #RLFCollected. We love reading your feedback and suggestions. Thank you so much for tuning into Collected. I'm Sonia Faleiro, and I really hope you'll join me again for our next deep dive into the writer's life.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag #RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.